Hi, this is Vanessa Marshall, the voice of Hera on Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to the Living Force podcast. Know the code.
You're listening to The Living Force, a Utini podcast.
Hello, I say over there.
Episode 26, an interview with George Mann, author of Star Wars Myths and Fables.
The Emperor has been expecting you.
Here are your hosts,
I have been expecting you.
Eric Eilerson and Dr. Charles Henkel.
I have tea, you have the sunlight, and all of us have episode 26 of the Living Force podcast. Welcome in. I am one of your hosts, Eric Eilerson. With me, as always, is Dr. Charles Henkel. Hey, buddy.
Hello, hello.
And in replacing Dr. Corey Helton, as we should have done 25 episodes ago, we have all the way from the UK, George Mann. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for coming on. Many of you may know the name George Mann. He is an author of one of our favorite hits from this year, Star Wars Myths and Fables, which we're going to dive into in a bit. But he also is the author of a bunch of amazing material from cool properties like Sherlock Holmes, Doctor Who, as well as his very own projects such as the Steampunk Adventures of Newbury and Hobbs. And tonight we are going to touch on a lot of his work in Star Wars, a lot of stuff about myth, and a lot of stuff like that. So we are super excited. George, thanks again.
Sounds great.
All right.
Can't wait to get stuck in.
Absolutely. So we are going to dive in similarly to how we always do by asking you just what was your very first experience with Star Wars as a property, whether it be the films or whatever it was, and then what was your first experience with the expanded universe?
Ooh, good questions. So I think my first experience, it's because I was very young, but I think my first experience with Star Wars was watching The Empire Strikes Back at the cinema with my granddad.
Awesome.
So I have very fond memories. He used to take me to see a lot of films. We saw The Dark Crystal. We saw a Star Trek Search for Spock. And I remember seeing Empire Strikes Back with him. I must have been kind of 5 years old.
That's kind of heavy for a 4-year-old.
I know, yeah, I know. But I think he just took me to the films that he wanted to see, which is cool. This is an excuse for him. Right. But yeah, I used to sit there with a bag of sweets and watch the show, and I remember being absolutely blown away by it. R2-D2 particularly, it was at that age was kind of this figure on the screen who completely fascinated me, and following that, my dad bought me the sticker book. And started buying me all the action figures, and I just fell deep down the well of Star Wars. So
awesome,
it was ace.
Yeah, I think R2 sticks with a lot of us when we're young because he's kind of like the perfect pet in a way, right? Like he's gonna follow you, but he can also like open doors and electrocute people. Like it's a great little combination of a pet.
That's it. He's like, you want an R2 by your side. I mean, even now I want an R2 by my side. To be honest, he's like, what a cool dude. Yeah. But I also think there's something about the size of him as well. It's like the closest you got to a child in those films is in terms of size, at least until you get the Ewoks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's kind of he's got a smaller person's perspective on the universe as well.
I love that. And then how did you jump into to the EU? So was it any books, or I know Kevin Scott, who we had on earlier, jumped into the Marvel Comics back in the day.
Yeah, so I had the comic. I think it's probably the same UK reprints of the Marvel Comics. Mm-hmm. So they were kind of slightly outsized, different. To the US standard comic, and often in newsprint as well. But yeah, I remember getting a bunch of those secondhand actually from car boot sales.
Oh yeah.
And just sitting and reading all these amazing new adventures. And then later, actually, I got at the age of 15, I got kind of a Saturday weekend job at a bookstore, and realizing properly for the first time that there were all these novels. That expanded the Star Wars universe, so delving into those as well, and things like Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the original Thrawn stories, the X-Wing pilot stories. So I don't know all of the EU, but I've dipped into quite a lot of it here and there, and loved everything I read.
Yeah, well, you just named some heavy hitters there, so it sounds like you're pretty well educated in that respect.
Oh, I was lucky being in a bookshop because I could see which books were the ones that were the most popular.
Yeah.
Okay, these are the ones that everyone's reading. Right, I'll follow those.
Absolutely.
Shadow of the Empire as well.
That's great. So George Lucas, whenever he created A New Hope, and ever since then, he's been quoted many times as saying that really what he was seeking to do was to create modern-day mythology. He said that there was really no modern-day mythology in storytelling for the kids in that generation, so initially in the 70s, and that really was his mission. So in your own words, what exactly is a myth, and how does Star Wars fit into that?
Wow. I think myths for me are archetypal stories. They're stories that are rich in fantasy, but also have a moral core to them, or you learn something by reading them. They're the means by which people are taught, and I think that's why if you look back all the way back to Greek mythology and Aesop's fables, and it's the transmission of ideas. And the transmission of morals and helping people find their moral compass through example, I suppose. So I think myths really are part of the oral tradition of storytelling that goes back to presumably early man, and you're sitting around the fire before people were writing stories down. And I'm sure they were telling stories.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's part of that tradition. And I think what George Lucas absolutely achieved with Star Wars is that goal of going, here's a modern story that feels like it belongs in that canon of ancient myth. It's a story that has wide appeal, that shows you the way. There's very clearly delineated good guys and bad guys, and so as a kid you can latch onto that. You know which guys you're supposed to be rooting for and which ones you aren't. But then I think has that wonderful thing of, as the story developed over the years, became more complex, so that it can be viewed or read on different levels. So now that you've got the grey of what happened with Anakin and kind of understanding his fall and where he was coming from, that he was doing things for what he felt were the right reasons, and all of those kind of bits of complexity, so that as an adult you can bring your own experience to the myth of Star Wars and find more depth in it. But as a child, you've still got those child experience for the first time, and I've seen this with my children, that kind of really clear good guys and bad guys, light side, dark side, and helping those children to go, okay, if I ever face a situation where I'm not sure, perhaps something I've learned from Star Wars will help me choose the way.
Yeah. I love that, because as a kid I was obsessed with Greek mythology, and some of the stories, as messed up as they get, the older you get and read more, I think they do have a really interesting thing about good and evil. And you're totally right. As you grow up, you get to get a little more complexity with each year, and the myth just kind of opens up. I love that.
And I think you're right. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to come on to Myths and Fables book, but I was drawing a lot from Grimm's fairy tales with that as well. And going back and looking at some of those original tales, some of them are really brutal. You think of them as children's stories, but you read Hansel and Gretel, the original version of Hansel and Gretel. I think it's, she's going to cook those kids, and they cook her instead. And you go, wow, okay, this is a story for kids. But of course, again, within that fantasy story is a moral about being careful about strangers and not going into people's houses and and not trusting people if you're not sure about them.
Yeah.
So it's got that kind of moral thing running through it as well.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of influences, you mentioned Grimm there. George Lucas has also been very, very open about how much he drew on Joseph Campbell's work for Star Wars, with the hero's journey and all that. Did you, for this book, because Joseph Campbell does work so much on the mythic structure and storytelling, did you draw on any of Joseph Campbell's theories for Myths and Fables, or were there other kind of research or theories that you latched onto?
Not specifically, although I'm aware of them, and I think I've absorbed them. So I think some of that happens naturally anyway now, because of years of writing and bearing those sorts of things in mind. But no, it was very much actually it was the following the format set by the Grimm's fairy tales was what I was aiming for, because I wanted that tone. So that was a major influence. And although I did go and look at the Greek myths and ancient Egyptian mythology and British folklore as well, which is full of weird, creepy nonsense, which I absolutely adore. I kept coming back to the kind of the structure of Grimm's fairy tales as the way of telling these stories as well.
Yeah. I mean, and that absolutely reads. I remember as we were reading on our team, we were jumping in our company Slack channel, and I remember saying like some of these stories as I was reading them like at night before bed, which I assume is the proper way to read these.
Absolutely,
it brought me back to hearing some of those stories as a kid, because some of them end really dark, but some of them did give you a little bit of that levity, and the way that you kind of navigated that tone was very reminiscent of Grimm. So yeah, that makes absolute sense to me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely we working with the Lucasfilm team, absolutely, we're trying to do with the book.
Yeah,
great.
You nailed it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, and we're going to dive a little more into specifics about that book in just a second, but first we're going to take a real quick break a little early and hear from a member of our Utini team, and then we will be right back with George Mann of Star Wars Myths and Fables. Be right back.
Hello there, Living Force listeners and fellow Star Wars fans. Podcast editor Matt Davenport here. Now, in past cameos, I've talked about my favorite EU books and my love of the Star Wars comics. Today, I want to tell you about my experience with the Star Wars trading cards from Topps. Now, before any EU book was released, before any action figure hit store shelves, there were the Topps trading cards. I was in the 3rd grade and had just started at a new school, and the prevailing feeling on the playground was, we gotta catch 'em all. The cards became like currency on the blacktop. Before Pokemon, before Beanie Babies, Star Wars trading cards were how we built our elementary empires. Now Economics 101 teaches the law of supply and demand, and there was a huge demand for this cardboard currency. Because I was new to the school, my parents drove around the neighborhood to familiarize themselves with the area, and while driving around, the family stopped into a little mom-and-pop corner market called Friendly Fred's. At the counter, I saw that they were selling the Star Wars cards. Now, this market was just 2 blocks away from my new school, and as the school year began, I hatched a plan. During lunch recess, I would sneak off the school grounds and purchase packs of cards from Fred's. Soon the other kids would give me their money to buy packs for them. My fee? I would just get first pick of 1 card in their pack. They could keep the gum. I built a cardboard kingdom on that playground, and that's how I got into collecting the Star Wars trading cards. Now let's send it back to Eric Charles and special guest George Mann on the Living Force podcast.
And we are back. Now we will escape from the reality of that great clip back into the myth of Star Wars Myths and Fables. So welcome back. We are with George Mann and Dr. Charles Hankel, who I'm going to throw it to for this next beautiful question.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the background of myths and what it means to Star Wars and how Star Wars fits into that idea, but now we really want to dive in deep into what you actually wrote, what you've actually contributed to the expanded universe. So if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about how the idea for Myths and Fables first came about? Like, whose idea was that? Who all worked on it? How did it come to be?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I was very lucky in that I was approached by Michael Siglain, who's the creative director of Lucasfilm Publishing, and I'm sure you guys know of him. Mm-hmm. What had happened, I'd met Mike socially, really, and he'd picked up one of my books. He's a big fan of horror, and I'd written a novel called Witchwood, which is a kind of a British crime horror novel, and taken it away and read it. And then when I saw him again a few months later, he said, "Oh, I've read Witchwood and I really loved it." And now part of the thing about Witchwood is the crimes are based on this kind of fictional mythology about a kind of Saxon warlock, and his kind of posse. And Mike said to me, was that based on real mythology, or is that something that you created? And I said, "Oh, I created it for the story." And he kind of just looked at me and went, "Do you think you could do that for Star Wars?" I went, yes, please. I would love to do that for Star Wars.
Maybe I could find it. Sure, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. So I was blown away, and he said, "Well, I've got an idea for a book, and it's a kind of Grimm's fairy tales for Star Wars, and I think you'd be the perfect guy to write it." I was like, "Oh, wow! This is a massive bucket list moment for me to get a Star Wars to contribute anything to the Star Wars universe."
Yeah.
So we had a bit more of a conversation about it, and then I went away and generated a whole bunch of ideas for stories. So I probably 25, 30 ideas for stories initially, which I sent their way, and then the team at Lucasfilm, so Mike, Caitlin Kennedy, who's my editor there, and the guys in the story group, looked over, Picked the ones I like best. Gave me some feedback. I was just coincidentally really lucky enough to be visiting because my brother lives in LA.
Oh wow!
He works in the film industry. So I happened to be visiting my brother. And around the time we were trying to consolidate which stories we were going to go with, so I said, well, I can pop down to San Francisco. I'm here. And so I managed to, pop into the Lucasfilm offices.
Perfect.
It's casual.
Sit with these guys, sit with Story Group, and talk through these stories. And Story Group were tremendous because they were, giving me some feedback on, maybe if we put this slant on this one and this slant on this one, maybe you could include this existing character in this story, and just giving me so much leeway to tell the stories I wanted to tell, which was a real surprise to me. I've written tie-in fiction for a few different universes, and sometimes, and I guess I'd always assume that the Star Wars stuff will be really nailed down. You can do this, but you can't do that. And I don't know whether that's a symptom of the fact it's a book of myths, or whether it's just because I've managed to navigate through the choppy waters with the ideas I was pitching, but they were really relaxed about it, and just, you go ahead and do your thing.
Wow.
We've heard that actually from other authors as well.
Right.
And when you hear that there's a story group, it sounds very intimidating. But from what we've heard from other people and from what you're saying, it sounds like it's actually very open for creative ideas and for multiple people working together to put out the best story that you can.
Exactly that. They were really encouraging.
Yeah.
I never thought I'd be allowed to create a new Sith Lord or new planets and stuff. But yeah, they just went great.
Yeah.
Go for it.
That's amazing.
Like in a way, the story group has almost become its own myth online because people just assume there's like this magical world where all of Star Wars is created and writers have to go in a dark room where Matt Martin just looks over them as they write. It's good to hear that's not the case.
I'm not saying that's definitely not the case.
True.
This is what Matt Martin told him to say today.
We see the projector you're reading off. It's fine.
Can neither confirm or deny.
I think my biggest takeaway from that story, though, might actually be that I need to pick up Witchwood by George Mann. So
absolutely,
I'll be looking that up.
It's very different from the Star Wars stuff, but it's at its heart, it's got that kind of that love of mythology and folklore, and I think that's what Mike was picking up on. Really, saw that I could weave that type of story, I suppose.
Yeah. Now touching on your kind of belief and skill with myth and folklore, I want to touch on the introduction to the book, because the introduction was something that I read with an early copy I was lucky enough to get from Lucasfilm. And I sent some stuff to the team. I was like, guys, this introduction just stopped me in my tracks. Because it said something that really struck a chord with all of us, because you wrote something that spoke towards our central beliefs here, which is when it comes to Star Wars, it doesn't quite matter if a book is strictly legends or strictly canon. All that matters is kind of the story, right? And you wrote that so beautifully. Now, can you explain kind of what made you decide to put that in the introduction? Because I feel like sometimes introductions in books kind of get glossed over, or they're fine, there's something, but that seemed really kind of personal.
Yeah, I think it is personal, and I was really delighted that I was allowed to express that sentiment there. I think it comes from years of being a fan, both of Star Wars and of other properties like Doctor Who. So before writing for Star Wars, I'd written a lot of Doctor Who. And one of the things I see a constant debate in Doctor Who fandom about canon. Is this canon? Is this not canon? Is this and with Doctor Who, because it's got time travel and events get rewritten and things. There's this constant debate about, well, did that story really happen or not? And you kind of go, well, actually, my philosophy over the years has become, of course they happened. They all happened.
Right.
A story is a story, and if it works for you and it touches you and you get enjoyment out of it, well, then that's got to be canon. Now, I know there's clear definitions of canon in Star Wars, and I understand why there has to be, so that the films that they're building at the moment, the books that they're building at the moment, feel cohesive and they relate properly to each other. And of course, it's a huge job to keep everything in people's heads. I've not read all of the EU books yet. I'm writing Star Wars. But I think that one of the things I really loved about writing this book was that it feels like it's on the borderline between both camps.
Yeah.
It's, so they're canon in the sense that these are stories that are told within the Star Wars universe to people talk, around campfires or to their children at bedtime, the sort of stories that Luke or Leia might have heard. But at the same time, the canonicity of the specifics is in question because the idea was that they're seen through many filters. That's how myths are transmitted.
Right.
That they might have been an original event, and it's been interpreted and seen through different cultures and different time periods and different voices to become the story that you're hearing now. Does that mean there is or isn't a Darth Kaldoth? I think I like to think there probably is a Darth Kaldoth in history, in canon. Did he specifically do the events that are set out in that story in the way they set out? That's a bit more of a question because it's a myth.
Right.
It's been transmitted. So, and that's how I feel about kind of as a fan about canon in general. I suppose as a storyteller, I always like to think that story comes first, canon comes second.
Love that.
Yeah.
And you have to respect canon, of course you do, and I absolutely do. But I'll never not pitch a story because something in canon says I can't, and then I'll have the conversation with the editors about, well, okay, can we nudge it this way and nudge it that way and still make it work?
Yeah.
And sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. But I think, that's my overall perspective, and that's very much the approach I took with the book.
I think that's perfect. I think that a lot of times nowadays there can be so much scrutiny that you lose the forest for the trees, and just because this character is in a ship and the ship had a different name in that other book that was written 7 years ago doesn't mean you can't enjoy the story for what it is. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's those kind of little things that can really just take away from the experience. Just sit back and enjoy the ride. That's what we're all here to do. That's why we're all Star Wars fans, is because of how much fun it is. And I think you lose the fun when you get into that kind of stuff.
I think there's a risk of it, yeah. And it's such a big universe as well.
Yeah.
All of this stuff could have happened.
Oh yeah,
all of it.
Absolutely.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We don't know half of what the ancient Egyptians were doing, and that was only 3,000-4,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We've got fragments of their civilization. Yeah. Well, that's what these are. These are myths like that are recovered stories from ancient history, from a fantasy universe.
100%. So I'd love to ask you a little bit more about those myths in particular, some of the ones from your book, if you don't mind. So to start things off, I am an avid fan of the character of Kenobi. He is my all-time favorite character in all of Star Wars. I will have to be careful right now not to just turn this into an entire conversation about Kenobi, but I'm also a really big fan of John Jackson Miller's novel of the same name, Kenobi. And we actually had John Jackson Miller on the show not too long ago and got to talk to him about that. And I know you had mentioned that maybe you hadn't read a ton of the old Legends material, and Kenobi was Legends, but I couldn't help but notice a lot of similarities between that novel and your story, The Knight and the Dragon. And so I was curious if you were inspired by any of Miller's work in that novel, or if you weren't, kind of what made you choose that story to start off your book?
Sure. So I've not read John's novel. I've read some of his other novels and loved them. But that's not one of the ones I've read. And a couple of people have said afterwards, it gels quite well with
it really does.
Yeah, it does.
Which is brilliant to hear. And I guess it's a symptom of drawing on the same source material. The way I approached that story was I wanted to do a George and the Dragon story. So there's a few stories in the book where it's clear, the starting point was Darth Vader is the boogeyman.
Right.
And there are others where I kind of went, well, I want to do a Hansel and Gretel type story, or I want to do a, George and the Dragon, and that's very much what I was doing here. And I thought, the Knight and the Dragon, and as soon as I thought about that, well, it had to be the Jedi Knight, and it had to be the Krayt Dragon.
Yeah.
It just seemed like the best fit. And some of these things, sometimes they just click. I've had another one happen with the. Again, jumping ahead with the new book, the Dark Legends book, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. But there's the Grand Inquisitor as Nosferatu. And I kind of went, oh no, that just fits.
Perfect.
It's one of those things where you just go, it just clicks into place, and that was what happened here. I just kind of went right. the warrior knight protecting people from the dragon, and I kind of thought, well, okay, well, how can I buck expectations here? And I thought, well, we've got to make it some people who are being protected, because they're often portrayed as the bad guys, or Tusken Raiders, and I just thought, well, what's their perspective on it? And that's one of the things I was trying to do with some of these stories, to go, let's put a different perspective in place, and so what's their perspective on the dragon and the knight who came out of the desert to save them, and how have they transmitted that story over the years?
Yeah. I think that's great. You mentioned that this may have been a similar theme in your short story and in John Jackson Miller's novel because of drawing from the same source material, but I think it's also from understanding the characters really well and the cultures and what they might think about it, because the fact that you all came up with very similar views on the Tusken Raiders and how they might view a Jedi and the Krayt Dragon. I mean, that's astonishing, but it shows that you understand the material really well, whether or not you've talked about it, whether or not you've even read his work. So that's fantastic. But
and I think that's a tribute to George Lucas, really. I mean, I think for painting such a vivid picture in the first place, that it's inspired us. I think when I talk to other Star Wars writers, it's they're constantly in awe of the original material, and I think that's what's going on there.
Oh, absolutely.
Now,
I know that you mentioned too that you noticed the copy of your book up here on my bookshelf, sure. And I can't help but notice that the cover is the image that was associated with the knight and the dragon. So what did you decide that was going to lead off the book, and did you decide that was the image that you wanted on the front?
No, I mean, I suppose it was always. Funnily enough, it was always the first story. It was the first story on the pitch document that I put together, and it just stayed being the first story. And I don't know. I mean, the guys at Lucasfilm decided on the running order of the stories,
right?
And I think I guess it's one of the stronger kind of easy to capture images. It's that kind of knight with the lightsaber and a dragon. It's going to draw people in, but it also tells you something immediately about the book, because it's clearly not Star Wars you've seen before.
Right.
It's not. It's not a portrait of Obi-Wan. It's some person's interpretation of a knight fighting a flying dragon. Well, obviously we know Krayt dragons don't really have wings.
Yeah.
So immediately you're in a land of myth within Star Wars as well, with that image. And I just have to take a moment just to say Grant Griffin's artwork is amazing throughout the whole book.
Tremendous.
No kidding.
My God.
He's lifted the book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just feel so lucky to have my stories associated with that artwork.
Yeah. And it's amazing because, us on at the Living Force and Utini, between all of us, we've read a bunch of stuff. I feel like we're pretty knowledgeable, but I gotta say, none of us guessed that cover was a Krayt Dragon when it first got announced. So that reveal when you read the story and realize what was happening is so beautiful, because you're absolutely right. Instantly we realize, okay, these can be twisted because we fought a Krayt Dragon in KOTOR or seen whatever. And now it's like, these are gonna flip these things on their head. And this beautiful artwork is going to kind of guide us through, and it was super effective.
Yeah. It was really inspiring to me. Like what we did once we worked out what the stories were going to be. As I wrote them, we had the outlines I'd done, and we worked out an art brief between myself and Lucasfilm, the editor at Lucasfilm, Caitlin. We worked out what the art brief was going to be for Grant. So I had kind of an idea, like a paragraph idea of what the art might look like. But then it would come in, and I'd be working on that story, or it would be the next story I was going to write, and I'd get this piece of artwork, and it was just it inspired me so much to get back to the keyboard to write, because I wanted to write the story of those people in that artwork. Although I didn't actually talk to Grant directly during the process, he played a huge part in the writing of the book with his art and by delivering the art the way he did.
Yeah. I mean, and as we definitely will get on to Dark Legends later on, but oh man, we cannot wait to see more of his work next year.
Yeah. Neither can I.
Now to jump to another story, you did mention this already, the Dark Wraith, right? Your story about Vader. You wrote about another fan favorite with Obi-Wan and then Vader. But rather than enforcing the will of the Emperor, as he usually does, we saw him in this story, he was enforcing the rules of the town, right? So what led to that decision to kind of use him as if you don't obey the rules, Vader's going to get you?
So again, it's that idea of what you go back to the roots of what is a boogeyman really, and why would parents tell their children that sort of tale, and it's to make them behave. Again, it's looking at the perspective of some normal people in the Star Wars universe. We tend to a lot of the stories we tend to follow Jedi and Sith, high-ranking rebels, powerful officers, but we don't often talk about the little guy. And on most planets in the Star Wars universe, they're not really gonna know what a Jedi or a Sith is, or
right.
If they do, they've got it's seen through that mythological filter. These are guys who live out in the stars. Most of these people haven't been to space. They live with it.
Yeah,
they might not have even left their city.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the big conversations I love to have about people wondering how do people not know that the Jedi were real 30 years after. I'm like, well, did you live on Coruscant? Probably not.
Yeah, exactly that. So what they've got is this kind of transmitted memory. I hesitate to call it a race memory because it's not a genetic thing, but like a transmitted memory of this horrible, terrifying, black-clad boogeyman with a flashing blade of red that comes and destroys things. They've lost the real reason that he was doing that. Maybe there was a Jedi he was searching for. Maybe there was. They were in rebellion, and he was quelling a rebellion in that city at the time for the Emperor. But what's happened is years and years and years later, all they know is that if you misbehave, i.e., if you rebel, then this terrible thing from the can come down from the sky and attack you, and and lay waste to, and it won't just be you; it'll be all your neighbours as well. That he gets, and you think, well, okay, there's an interesting story in that because it's Vader seen from a normal person's perspective. Why would they don't know anything about politics?
No.
Universal politics. So they're that's their perspective on why he would come. It's because people are misbehaving, they're rebelling, children are rebelling against their parents, and we know what happens to rebels.
Yep. So do your homework or you will be destroyed.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
In the future, when I have kids and I tell them to go to bed and they're not listening, I should just put on the Rogue One clip of Vader in the hallway. Like, this is what happens. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I love that you actually used him that way. I think that's really, really cool.
What I wanted to do was something different. Tell a story in a way that hasn't been told before in Star Wars.
Yeah.
I was always looking for that angle with the stories.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I love that the town, by the way, I don't think we mentioned it, is called Solus. That was great. A nice little touch there. So while you used a lot of, the best known characters in Star Wars, we mentioned Obi-Wan, Vader, you also created some of your own, and you've mentioned some of them already. You mentioned Darth Kaldoth already, but there was also the Wanderer, there was Ryan Nimbus, there was Shelish the Witch, there were many more. And I was wondering if there was any of those characters who had a particular inspiration from myth or from someone you know in real life. I don't know, just how did you come up with these characters?
Good question. It's the thing I love most, actually, in my writing, in the activity of writing, is creating new characters. And I need to just drop in that actually Shelish and Awachi are not my creations. They were in Star Wars Uprising, the mobile game.
Oh, I didn't even know this.
Yeah, that's where they're from. So that was a personal callback because I was doing my research and going, the Night Sisters got obliterated.
Yeah.
Are there any that could still be alive? And in Star Wars Uprising, Shelish was living on the moon of Jar.
Oh, fantastic.
Thought, with a black Wookiee called Awachi, and I'm like, right, I'm going to use that. And that was one that actually where the guys at Story Group were like, I can't believe anyone's actually picked up some characters from Star Wars Uprising to use in a new story. But yeah, so to go back to your question, it's something I'm always looking to do, to be honest, is to create new characters because I do love writing about like Vader or Obi-Wan, I to get a chance to play with those toys. What it is like playing with the toys that I had as I was a kid, and creating stories like that. But at the same time, they're kind of protected by plot armor, if you see what I mean. I can't kill Obi-Wan in the story. Nope. Even in a myth, it's not going to work
because we know that he's alive. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So creating new characters and then hoping you can make people care about them, then allows you that sense of risk and a reader's not knowing what's going to happen in the story. So that was part of the tactic, and part of it was just me going, I just want to create new characters in Star Wars. I wanted to create a new Sith Lord. Yeah. I mean, who doesn't? Who doesn't want to create a new Sith Lord?
Yeah.
Who was a Duros, by the way? And that really spoke to me. We had an RPG and I played a Duros. I love that species. So
cool.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that.
No problem. I'm trying to get, at the moment, they did an action figure of a Duros years ago, and I'm trying to find one so that I can make a Darth Kaldoth out of it and put cloak.
We'll put the call out to the Living Force audience. Someone help out George Mann. Get
tweet
this
at us. Get us that figure. One of you has it in a basement. Come on.
I was looking around all of New York Comic Con trying to find one, but I couldn't find one. So yeah, I mean, how I come up with them, I don't know. I mean, I suppose part of it is dictated by the story, in the sense you go, what type of story do I want to tell? And with Gaze of Stone, I wanted to tell a story that was true to the Sith. In the it's about betrayal and fear and anger and jealousy. And envy, and so what's the best way to do that is to create two new Sith. So you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and it is just personally, that is the most horrifying story in the book to me. I mean, I remember reading that and just it was chilling. Once I realized what was happening, and once you realize the twist that's happening, and just kind of as a reader, you can't stop it. But I see what's going to happen. That was very, very traditionally myth, fairy tales. Scary, I think, because I think turning to stone also, like, there's so many great stories about turning to stone. I think that's something that us as people are really scared of, weirdly. I think that keeps showing up.
It's kind of like a base fear, isn't it? Like being buried alive, falling, and being turned to stone, and there's probably a few others as well. So it's absolutely kind of wanted to pull on that thread. But yeah, it's I guess part of the story there is about inevitability. If you follow that path, inevitably one thing is going to happen, which is that you're going to die, or well, I suppose you are eventually.
Right.
So yeah, and that's one of the stories that gets picked up the most by fans who've read the book. Quite a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, that's my favourite story in there." Yeah. It's mine flips depending on my mood. Some days it's that one, some days it's The Witch and the Wookiee.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I love writing new characters, and there's an interesting thing about the Wanderer, because everyone's assumed it's a new character, and I'm not going to confirm or deny, but when I talked to the story group guys about it, we kind of went, "Oh, which of the Jedi could it be?" And we talked about which existing character it might be.
I
might
had thoughts, yeah.
So it might be, or it might be. I mean, that's the beauty again of leaving things ambiguous, is that people can fill their own space and go, right, no, I want it to be a new character, and that's cool.
Yeah.
Or it might be an existing character as well, and that would fit as well.
Yeah. Because my biggest question, I love the Wanderer as well, was where did the Wanderer go? And maybe if I knew that answer, then I could confirm whether or not it is who it might be.
Did he go to Octo, maybe? Like, who knows?
I'm not saying.
All right, fair enough. So when Myths and Fables was first announced, there was potentially a slight misconception that it was a purely children's storybook. But since we've gotten our hands on it, both on the Living Force and Utini, we've been kind of telling people that that's not exactly it. But in your mind, when you were creating it, who was this book written for? And even more than that, do you think there's an ideal age for mythology? I know we talked earlier, it kind of evolves, but do you think there's a perfect time in your life when you're kind of all
that's
in
a
it?
good question. So it was written for all ages, and I genuinely mean that. It was like, so I've written mostly for adults in my life, but I have written for children before. And I'm very much of the belief that to write for children, you don't write down.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
You just tell them the story. So at no point did I think I have to modify the way I'm writing this because a child's going to read it. But actually, if there's a few words in there that the child doesn't know and they ask their parents about it or their teacher about it, or they look it up, then maybe that child's learned a new word, and that's a great thing.
Exactly. Love that.
So that's kind of, so I approached it like that. We did have to make sure, well, actually, no, all the way through, I kept thinking, I'm sure when this gets to Lucasfilm, they're going to say you can't have the dragon digging up children and eating them, or you can't have this person, And I was kind of expecting that all the way, and at no point did they say that. So it went through, and again, I think if you go back to those original Grimm's fairy tales and you see things like the children in the oven, in the witch's house, in Hansel and Gretel, and you think, well, okay, then what we're doing is being true to the type of story that we're writing, which is already sold as children's fiction,
right?
But also as classics of literature. So I was thinking all ages when I wrote it. I've got a 16-year-old son, and he's been my test for every story that comes off the printer. I go, read that before I do anything else with it.
Oh, that's cool.
Wow.
And he's a huge Star Wars fan as well, so he'll like pick me up on any inaccuracies as well as whether the story works.
Oh man, so I can imagine. I mean, you were pretty geeked when you got the ask. What was his reaction when you said, "Hey, Dad's gonna write Star Wars"?
Oh, brilliant! I mean, he's been absolutely brilliant because he comes to the gym with me and we'd sit on the exercise bikes, and I'd go, right, I'm thinking about a story, lots of ideas, some that didn't get used. So I'm thinking about a story about Excalibur with a lightsaber. It's brainstorm, and he'd input into the stories a little bit, and and that kind of thing, and we'd bounce them back and forth, and so he's been brilliant, and I mean, he's got a copy of the book upstairs. I mean, him and my daughter were both thanked in the front of the book.
Yeah. We thank them as well then for the input because it got us great stories. That's so cool.
Yeah. So in terms of perfect age, I kind of think that they really are for any age. I mean, I guess maybe 10 is probably the youngest, maybe 8 to 10 maybe. But then beyond that, I wouldn't put a limit on it.
No,
but,
no. I mean, I think that it's not wrong to say that at any age we kind of do need a fundamental reminder of some of these stories sometimes, or some of these lessons. I mean, sometimes when stuff gets really hard, if you just go into an old school myth or a new myth now that has a good story and a moral, it's like, oh, right. Okay, yes. Let me remember that as I go into my big adult life of a story that I learned as a 10-year-old,
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes it is, we get into these complicated situations when you get into the gray areas of adulthood, but you really can draw on the simplicity of some of these myths, and they still apply, even in some of the most complex situations. And it's actually a perfect segue into our next question for you, because, each individual story in Myths and Fables has its own moral, or at least its own major idea, but what is the biggest thing that you hope that readers take away from the book as a whole?
Oh, wow. I've not even thought of an answer for that question. What's the biggest thing? I think it's got to be something to do with creativity and stories, and what stories are and what they can do. And kind of the stuff I was talking about in the introduction that we talked about. That idea that all stories matter. And it doesn't matter whether they're true stories or they're fiction, whether they're written by a kid or an adult, whether they're written down and printed or told orally. I think, stories are what make us who we are. And I think stories define our history. I think stories will be the things we carry, the lessons. They carry the lessons of the past into the future, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably that's probably, it sounds quite grand, I suppose.
I
but
say
that's
for not knowing an answer to that question, that's pretty beautiful of an answer. I'll tell you that. I mean, that's kind of why we all get into Star Wars in the first place, right? Is because it's a story, and it helps us, again, when we're younger, figure out kind of how to be like you were mentioning as a kid. What would Luke or Leia do in this situation can help you out, and same now with kids reading this book. Like, okay, how can these myths and these stories help my life, and how can they bring me joy when I'm sad or anything like that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I said this at New York Comic Con on the panel, actually, and got a cheer from someone in the audience. But I think one of the things about Star Wars is it helps you to think about what's the right thing, not the easy thing.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be one of the core lessons of for the Rebels and Luke, and Han actually is a great person who exemplifies that, a good character. The easy thing is to run away, and the hard thing is to stay and fight against the odds. In their case, but that's often a question we have to ask ourselves throughout our lives. I think, isn't it? It's what presented with a situation, do I do the easy thing or do I do the right thing?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, now you mentioned New York Comic Con, so let's jump in. So at New York Comic Con, there were a bunch of projects announced, but one specific project was a huge shock to us and a joyous surprise. A surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Was the sequel to this book, Star Wars Dark Legends. So please, we know you can't say much, but
I can't say a lot.
Can't say a lot, but what can readers expect from this book? What excites you the most about it? The floor is yours for this new project. So
basically, I think I mentioned when I put together the initial ideas for this story, there were tons we couldn't use.
Right.
Now, that's not to say we've taken the stories we didn't use and put them in the new book, but more that it was an example of kind of how far we can go with this type of story. How and some of the stories are quite dark, as you mentioned, things like Gaze of Stone, and Mike Siglain had said to me, I'd love to do a book for Halloween that follows on, like scary, spooky stories, but done in the same way. So yeah, basically we decided, let's just not stop. Let's just do another round. So I just kind of put together another 20 story ideas, and pitched them out, and they picked the ones they liked best again and refined them down. And I've just been working on them. In fact, just before you called, I was just finishing one of the stories that's going in the book.
Oh my god!
Awesome, and it's called.
I can't say.
Oh, we tried.
The one story we talked about at New York Comic Con is called The Orphanage. And that's the one I mentioned with the Grand Inquisitor as Nosferatu. The idea, it's an orphanage that's on a kind of pretty deserted world. It's after the Clone Wars are finished. It's where a lot of the children have been sent who've lost their parents in the Clone Wars.
Oh wow!
And they have pretty grim place because the world itself that they're on has been brutalized by the Clone Wars as well. And there's a story, and you follow a new girl who's arrived, and the story is amongst the children of this creature that comes in the night through the window and takes away some of the special kids. What happens after that, basically? So and Grant's. I didn't even know we were announcing the book on the panel until that day.
Oh my god!
And then Mike said, "Oh, we can talk about it." I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant!" I hadn't seen the logo and I hadn't seen the mock-up of the art, and it's literally just a sketch from Grant, but he's got the Grand Inquisitors kind of doing the Nosferatu pose, and it's tremendous. Yeah. So, I mean, to give you an idea of the flavour of the book. The working title, which is obviously we're calling it Dark Legends, but the working title was Siths and Legends.
Oh my god! Oh no, I want an alternate printing now.
So that's the flavour of it, So stories of the dark side to tell at night, coming out for Halloween next year.
Oh, awesome. When we talked about myths and fables for the first time on the podcast, we were saying, we love this so much, and can't there just be more because of the style, because they're all individual stories, and we were happy to see that we were right. Because I hope that, obviously we're so excited for this book, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it a lot as the year goes on. But again, that's a Halloween one, then maybe there's another one of another style, because apparently if you can just bust out 20 story ideas, I mean, you know?
Well, 20 ideas.
Yeah.
Not all of them are necessarily good.
Oh, sure.
I would love to keep going, and we'll have to see how, whether that's something Lucasfilm want to do. I'll keep writing Star Wars till they forcibly take their pen out of my hand.
Brilliant.
So fingers crossed for this and other projects. I'd love to contribute a novel to the EU at some point as well.
I mean, we'd love to read it.
Bring it on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bring it on.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Hey, ours too. Now, we actually like to round out all of our interviews with the same question. We like to ask some deeper questions on this podcast, so I'm going to warn you up front. This one's a little bit of a doozy.
Okay.
But essentially, Star Wars is a constantly growing and evolving story, like we've been talking about, and it is molded and informed by every single character and every content creator that becomes a part of the story. And with your contributions, what is the legacy that you hope to leave behind for yourself in the Star Wars universe? What do you want to be remembered for when fans think of George Mann? What do you want to be known for?
That is a tough question. What do I want to be known for? I guess it's a two-part answer. I guess I suppose if a big ambition, I suppose I'd like people to look at these two books and think there's someone who broke the mold a little bit and told some stories in a different way. So a new slant on the Star Wars universe. I guess that would be my big ambition. Failing that, the guy who created Darth Kaldoth.
Well,
well, that one's in the bag, and I think you're well on the way to the first one as well.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. I hope so.
Yeah.
It'll be nice.
I mean, no question. For us here at Utini and myself especially, I think this book and your work have really opened us up to maybe some unknown preconceptions we had about storytelling. About, if it's an all ages book, does that mean that I can't read it and enjoy it? Or if it's going back to stories I loved as a kid, can I not now enjoy them as an adult? And you have absolutely smashed those, and we cannot wait for you to keep writing more of those stories.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, and we'll get that Dark Kaldoth full novel before long, I'm sure.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing?
The best. So before we close things out officially, we want to give you a moment to plug your social media accounts, websites, anything upcoming. Where can our listeners go find you, and what should they be looking out for?
So the best place to find me is on Twitter. That's usually where I'll be. It's at George_Mann. I'm on Facebook too. I'm very, very bad at updating my website because I'm usually writing, so I don't.
Which is good though, right?
Yeah. So it's not really up to date, but Twitter's where you'll find all the latest news and stuff coming up. Well, about Dark Legends.
Yeah.
I've got another Nubian Hobbs book in the works.
Lovely.
Which is my own kind of steampunk series. Some new comics coming from a couple of publishers next year. So keep people, if they enjoy Myths and Fables, hopefully they'll enjoy some of my other work.
Absolutely, go check that out.
No doubt.
And again, we're gonna send some thanks to you and to your son for giving you all those great story ideas. So if you,
Thank you, yeah.
For our listeners, definitely you've heard us list off a bunch of George's work. And if for some reason you haven't picked up Myths and Fables yet, head over to utini.com, read our review of how much we loved it, and go pick it up yourself so you can get ready for Dark Legends next Halloween. But with that, we'd like to thank you, George, once more for taking the time to visit us here. It's been so lovely having you on, and we truly hope you'll come on again and we can chat more about some stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, give me a shout anytime.
Will do.
Awesome.
So that, my friends, will do it for this week's episode of The Living Force. If you are new here, don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in every week to hear us at Utini talk about the Star Wars Expanded Universe, sometimes with George Mann. Please leave us a review over on iTunes to help people find us, and head over to utini.com for reviews, articles, and comprehensive book profiles on every single story in the Star Wars galaxy. If you're looking to buy some books like Myths and Fables and you want to help support the show, look up your book on Utini, click the Amazon link on the profile, and we'll get a few cents to help keep the lights on. If you'd like to help us out a little more directly, you can find us over on patreon.com/Utini, where you can join Dylan Sasser, Adam Dyson, Timothy Dunlap, Rural Farm Boy, Chris Richmond, Juliana Mendez, Adrian Carlson, Ross Greco, and Terratano. If you want your thoughts on this show, email us at livingforcepod@utini.com, tweet at us at livingforcepod, or join our Utini Discord community by going to utini.com/discord. You can find us individually. We are all on Twitter. I am at Eric Eilerson. Corey, when he's here, is at Doc Star Wars MD, and Charles is at C. Henkel. A special thank you, as always, to Matt Davenport, our amazing editor, Freddie, our producer, and Wes, our community manager. Thank you to George and Charles for podcasting with me this week. And as always, may the Force be with you.
There is no hatred. There is joy. There is no division. There is union. There is no apathy. There is passion. There is no gatekeeping. There is community. This is the Utini Star Wars Fan Code. Embrace it, live by it, and above all, trust in the living force. That's all for this week. Join our community and surround yourself with like-minded fans by visiting us online at utini.com. Until next time, may the force be with you.
How many times has this happened to you?
I just finished reading Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor, but what should I read next?
Worry not, Star Wars fans, because Utini is here to save the day.
What's a Utini?
Utini.com is the place to go before you pick up that next Star Wars EU novel. From A-Wings to Zori Bliss, let the team at Utini be your guide to all things EU. Legends to canon, Utini has you covered. Hey there, Padawan. You look like you're a Yoda fan.
I sure am. He's the coolest.
Then use Utini's super search engine to discover novels and comics that feature our short green friend. So visit utini.com today, because now there's a better way to discover the Star Wars expanded universe. And now live on the website, the Utini Bookshelf 3.0.
3.0 is the way to go.